tonight. Let's get going. I'm just so anxious to meet Brandon and have him talk to us about the Chronicles. So one thing about Brandon before I bring him on is I want to just show you Breitbart's website here, and I want you to know where you can follow Brandon's work. So I've got Breitbart's website here on the right hand side of this image, and if you go down to the World tab, the second thing under that is Breitbart. Um, Cartel Chronicles, and that's where you're going to find his work. So hopefully you'll all check him out after we talk to him. But let me introduce you to our guest tonight. One thing before we do that, tonight we will be using the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. If you have questions for Brandon, move the mouse down to the bottom of the screen to access the Q&A menu to ask questions. We're just fortunate tonight to have Brandon Darby with us. Brandon joined Breitbart in 2010. He was focusing on human trafficking and cartel violence along our southern border. Numerous cartel bosses have been arrested due to the reporting of Breitbart Border Cartel Chronicles. And Brandon was responsible for the first reporting in photos depicting the U.S.-Mexico border crisis in 2014. His work gives voice to the voiceless. He and Ildelphius Ortiz, maybe you can help me with that name, Brandon, co-founded the Chronicles, which is a citizen journalist project that allows people living under cartel control to provide on-the-ground reporting using pseudonyms. Pseudonyms, almost like the days before the revolution when people always talked in pseudonym names. The stories that Brandon produces are printed in Spanish and English. I think there's a translate button also. So tonight you're going to learn about some of those really interesting stories. So Brandon, welcome to Empower You. We're so glad you're with us. Welcome.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. I'll just tell you this. Most of you are in Ohio. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That means a lot to me, and it means a lot to my team. That people as far away as Ohio are paying attention and caring enough to spend their evening and their time discussing what's going on our border and in Mexico and across the country, including in Ohio.
We've had a lot of classes on the border, Brandon, and we've actually gone, a group of us have gone down there. We've done classes from there, and we've really, really followed it with a lot of interest what's going on. And why don't you tell us just by starting off, I think that Cartel's Chronicles started in 2014. What in the world gave you the idea to do that?
Well, that's a good question. We were noticing that we were covering the border, and we were covering the border at a time when it really wasn't popular to cover the border. It wasn't marketable. It wasn't popular. It was just a labor of love, so to speak. But we started making border trips. We started learning what was going on, and we started learning about cartels in Mexico, and that those people in Mexico don't stay in Mexico. They operate in the United States as well. But we started thinking, like, what could be done to address what was happening with cartels. And one of the things I noticed is that, I ran a shelter for human trafficking victims, and most of the people in the shelter were being sheltered there, and they either had T visas or U visas, which means that they were witnesses, either witnesses for law enforcement or for the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, because they had been victimized. And what I realized was that most of the time the U.S. government would go after these low-level guys, but the people they worked for in Mexico were never being prosecuted. And I couldn't comprehend why. Like, why wouldn't the U.S. do something where people in Mexico were doing so many bad things in our country, on our soil, in Texas and the United States? So we started really putting our heads to it and bringing all the greatest minds we could together, right-leaning voices, left-leaning voices, professors, people who worked at in morgues and process the bodies of these people. We started talking to everyone we could. And I came across an interview from many years ago. It was probably over a decade old when I came across it. And it was a cartel boss who was a U.S. citizen, but he also in Mexico. And he ran a cartel called the Beltran-Leyva cartel. And what he said was, it was unfortunate for him because he lived in Texas too. And he was very handsome, right? So it was unfortunate for him because a lot of the US media would cover him. They called him the Barbie, right? The Barbie, because he was a handsome guy. And what he said was that he said it was great. I could run my organization, but the second that US media started covering me, it embarrassed Mexico. And so Mexico started to come after me. Then I had to hide in a basement, and I couldn't go and drive my fancy cars. I couldn't hang out with my fancy women. I couldn't go to nightclubs anymore. And he said, ultimately, I couldn't run my organization. And it destroyed my organization because US media were covering me, and it embarrassed Mexico so bad they came after me. And that's when it clicked. And I said, okay, the answer is US media. That's the answer. The answer is US media that primary voters read, and then primary voters start to care. And that makes politicians respond and start to care what the primary voters care about. And then we said, well, how are we going to do this? So what we did was, at that time, there were a number of journalists. People don't realize this, but in Mexico, it's actually each year, it's either the first or second most dangerous place for journalists because they have the highest number of murders per year of journalists in the world, right? They get killed. And what we did was we started to go to Mexico and try to meet with these journalists who were putting things on Twitter at the time. They would put reports on Twitter, and a lot of them were getting murdered for it, but they were doing it under pseudonyms, but they would get discovered somehow and they would get murdered. And we said, hey, instead of just, risking your life to expose this bad guy to 200 people, why don't you, instead of putting it on Twitter, give the stories to us? We'll publish it in English and Spanish, and then millions of people will read. You're risking your life anyways, but millions of people will read it. And I told them the whole thing, or what LaBarbie had said in the interview, and I walked them through the plan, and they agreed. And so the more that happened, the more other journalists started to reach out. A lot of them were cartel connected, and we realized what they were doing, but we were able through a network to check on who was who. And the program just took off. And the next thing you know, we're in every dark place in Mexico. And by dark, I mean, there's no reporting coming out of there in mainstream outlets. The US government doesn't have really good representation there. That if somebody's a bad guy there and they go hide there, the US government can't get them there, right? Because these groups have control. So we are literally the only information being not only given to the American public, but also that's given to US law enforcement about certain people, because some of the information we get is there's no benefit to publishing, right? The address of a cartel boss who's wanted by the US government, there's no benefit. So what we do is we give it to people that we know, relationships we've met along the way. And that's how it started, and that's what it's turned into, to where now we have millions of readers. And when we go after a cartel boss, when we start to really focus on a cartel boss, Mexico gets embarrassed. Mexico sends in more troops. Then there's more conflicts with that cartel boss and the troops. We have more stories to write about that cartel boss. And then we start to publish, people in his organization start to share information. Some are because they're altruistic and they're just people in the community. Some are because they don't like their boss and he's a jerk to them. So they get him in trouble and don't tell us where his stash houses are, and we'll publish where his stash houses are. And then, so we just rain hellfire down. And ultimately what happens is that cartel boss either gets killed or he gets arrested. That's what happens. So a few times, things have gone really south with the cartel boss. Uh, we had one in Michoacan who put $100,000 hit out on our team. And consequently, the next day he had, or about a week later, he had his door kicked in, and we published this photo of him getting arrested, right? That no one else had. So it let him know that we knew people involved. And I think they all kind of got the message that if you mess with U.S. journalists, especially ones connected to power, like obviously Breitbart has a lot of relationships, it doesn't work out well for you. So far we have not been killed, So what we do.
Thank you. Question: is Breitbart censored in any way in Mexico?
No, not censored, but well, it's funny you say that. When you say censored, the government does not censor Breitbart, but if you share Breitbart articles, you could very well get killed for it in a lot of places in Mexico.
You mean share on you mean share on social media?
Correct. So what they do is they all share on messenger apps. They'll share articles. And what else happens is kind of weird, but so in Mexico, they won't go after the cartel boss, but if we write it first, they'll say, oh, Breitbart wrote this report about these people, right? And for some reason, they don't get killed for that. I don't know why, but then news outlets will do that. But another thing to mention is that the majority of the news outlets in Mexico, they all have somewhere called a link, right? LINK. And that link is very similar to a Communist Party binder, like back in the Soviet Union, right? That link is known to be connected to a cartel, or that link will tell people, this is how you're going to cover this. This is what you're going to say. This is, you're going to cover this protest. You're not going to cover that protest. You're going to say things this way. And they all know that they have to do it or they'll get killed, right? So when you say isn't censored, they have a mechanism to censor us, but it isn't through formal channels like we would think of in a communist nation or something.
Now, would you pronounce your teammate's name for me?
Yeah, and don't feel bad because it's very common. It was hard for me at first. His name is Ildefonso Ortiz. And none of the stuff that we do at Breitbart with cartels would be possible without Ildefonso. But we call him Poncho because it's much easier to say Poncho than it is to say Ildefonso.
So you and Poncho, do you kind of just travel around incognito?
More so in the past. At this point, I mean, we have so many team members and we send other people to do certain things. But in the past, we had to, you have to remember, we wanted this project so badly to work. And so we had to put ourselves in a lot of bad situations to go meet, you go meet these journalists. Like I told you, a lot of them work for cartels. So if journalists from a new state and we have no relationship say, hey, we want to meet with you, but we can't be seen meeting with you. So we need you to cross the border at night and meet us in this industrial park at 11 p.m., right? We don't know if they are really sincere and they're going to, start a new branch of the project for us, or if they're setting us up and going to kill us, right? So initially, we had a lot of experiences like that, but now we have so many relationships that we really don't always have to be there any longer, we really don't have to, if we were going to do a new state, there are some states that we don't have representation in Mexico. We would probably have to. But even then, now our networks are so expansive that we could figure out who we were meeting with and whether it was safe for us pretty quickly.
Now, how many states are there in Mexico?
Well, that's tricky. So 10 years ago, there were 31 states and the federal district. Now there's 32 states, and the federal district became a state. So there's 32 states in Mexico.
And how many teammates do you have throughout those 32 states?
right now we have 17 writers.
That's
Several
incredible.
of them cover multiple states, and several of them have, you know, sourcing in other states. But an important thing to mention, Mexico. Anyone can Google this, but Mexico is listed as a fragile nation, a fragile state, right? It's not a failed state, but it's a fragile state, meaning it teeters. So out of those 32 states, there are more states that are under the control of various, the fancy word for cartels is transnational criminal organizations, a fancy term, right? And there are more states that are under the control of paramilitary transnational criminal organizations than there are that are under the control of Mexico's central government. Um, Mexico, like if they want to go into Michoacan or they want to go into Sinaloa, the federal government can't send 3 or 4 or 10 FBI agents or federales to go and get someone. They have to send in armored divisions of Marines. When they go, they sometimes get military helicopters shot down out of the sky. These folks have every imaginable form of weaponry because they have every bit of money in the world, right? They have Russian RPGs. They have rumored to have manpads. They have all types of surface-to-air missiles, and I mean these are little military organizations, right?
So before we start talking about Mexico, let me I just kind of want to frame your work. You're also covering what percentage of your work that you're doing is about Mexico? I mean, when I looked on the site today, I saw some other interesting stories about, for instance, Spain, and I saw a story about Greg Abbott in Texas. But what percentage of your work on the cartels is about Mexico?
Well, the majority, couldn't say the super majority, the majority. I mean, we cover, okay, so you have to get into our head of how we look at this, right? We cover what other people are afraid to cover. Okay. So we have covered the border for years and years, like aggressively covered the border for the majority of the last, 13 years, 12 years. The majority of that time I have spent going to 2 or 3 sectors on the southwest border every month, right? So I would travel 10 days a month. I was a single dad at the time, so I had to balance that, but 10 days a month was my rule. And there's 9 sectors on the southwest border. And for years, I visited sectors, right? And agents would meet with me, Border Patrol agents on the US side. They would tell me where the holes were, what was wrong, what problems they faced. And I would report those just nonstop for years. We started the Cartel Chronicles project, and then that allowed us to report on the border from the Mexican side, basically, right? So we had this, we called it like a total informational awareness about the U.S. border, U.S.-Mexico border, right? Very holistic. We had all angles of it covered, right? All north and south. Well, once everyone started to report on the border, right, then we would patch in the holes and do it. But at this point, there are so many people reporting on what happens on the US-Mexico border that we won. We're successful, right? That's our job is to organize ourselves out of a job, right? To set up, things that allow us to move on to the next dark place in the world, right?
Well,
you get what I'm getting at? So now more of our focus is on what cartels are doing in Mexico than has been the case in past years, but that's just because of that dynamic I discussed with you.
How many cartels are there in Mexico? Are there a limited number with little tributaries under them, or is it a wide number?
Okay. So this is an interesting question because it actually gets into something we'll talk about later, which is what the U.S. doing working in Mexico? Is it working, right? Is it working? Okay. If you were a liberal and you always have to find something completely negative to say about the US government or the United States or our law enforcement, then you can make a really good argument that we're creating more violence. Okay. But the problem is that once you engage with logic and the rules of logic, ultimately, no, we are actually doing a good thing the way that we're handling cartels. So we'll take the Gulf cartel, a major cartel along the US-Mexico border. Okay. The Gulf cartel got decapitated because of the pressure of the US government, right? It got decapitated again. It got decapitated again. Now the Gulf cartel is really about, maybe fair to say, 6 or 7 different cartels. They all call themselves the Gulf cartel, but they're really just a bunch of glorified gangbangers. They used to be a cartel that had national power, could influence what the federal government of Mexico did. Now they're lucky if they influence what a mayor of a city does. Okay. Because they are so fractionalized. They're into 6, 7 main groups. There's probably 10 more splitter groups. We have destroyed, we've decimated them that's what the US has done. We take Los Zetas. Los Zetas tried to do what Philip Morris did, and they had to rebrand themselves and change their name because they were getting destroyed by the US government. So now Los Zetas is multiple different cartels. They all call themselves Los Zetas, but really they're multiple little criminal groups who are still deadly, still scary. They have no federal power. Now we go to the Sinaloa cartel. We call it the Sinaloa cartel. That has historically been the largest in Mexico. Really, they're called the Sinaloa Federation, and they're comprised of about 1,100 different criminal groups who are under the allegiance, under the flag of the Sinaloa cartel. Now they're all fighting each other, right? Because we've decapitated them so successfully, so many times. And really the only one that controls most of the federal government as far as the military and the law enforcement apparatus at this point is the cartel called CJ&G, which is Cartel Jalisco. We'll just call it that. And it's controlled by a guy named El Mincho, and he is thriving with what the US is doing. But that's because he has so much federal power in Mexico that Mexico is helping Trump stop cartels, but they're just helping Trump stop all of the cartels who are enemies of CJ&G. You get it? And I think the Trump administration is trying to deal with that. But there are thousands upon thousands of criminal groups who call themselves cartels in Mexico right now.
And if you had to tell me the top 3 things that they do, would they be fentanyl, meth, extortion of businesses, or what would the top 3 things that
they do?
Yeah.
It depends on the cartel. So with the Gulf cartel, since about 2014, they have made more money from bringing migrants. And when I say migrants, there's a reason I use that term. People who are turning themselves in to the US authorities, not people sneaking in, right? People turning themselves in, right? They've made more money from that than they have from drugs, we believe. So their primary business model is appealing to bleeding hearts in the US and having people apply for asylum, right? That asylum seekers are their primary business model. If we go to El Mincho, it's going to be methamphetamine and fentanyl, for them. If we went to, it just depends on the various cartel, but overall, I would say methamphetamine, fentanyl, cocaine, human smuggling, right? Human smuggling. Those are the things that a lot of people don't realize this, but as a country, we are a very loving country, contrary to what a lot of people say. Um, in our country, the very thing that we were doing, thinking we were helping the world by allowing all of these people to show up and turn themselves in, was actually fueling the very groups that these people were fleeing from in the first place, right? We've actually caused untold amounts of there's nothing um there is nothing humanitarian, right, about a de facto open border or an unsecured border. The way that it is structured is there's nothing good about it. We could get into that another time or get into it later, but just trust me when I tell you that. But the previous target of us, who now we don't write about as much because they're decimated multiple times over, is the Gulf Cartel. And like I said, they've made in the last 10, 11 years, they've made more money from bringing asylum seekers to the U.S. border than they've made from drugs.
Well, let's talk about fentanyl. Is fentanyl, we know the precursors come from China, but is Mexico starting to manufacture those precursors themselves?
Well, that's an interesting topic. I think Mexico will ultimately do that. By Mexico, I mean, criminal groups in Mexico will make sure that's done. But, there started to be something I started to see in about 2013, 2014. And I started to see Mexican criminal groups, Mexican cartels manufacturing methamphetamine in the United States, right? So they weren't even, they got out of the business of, not that they're out of it, but they didn't have to smuggle it anymore. They were, what happened is I was looking at all these indictments on this website called Pacer, where you can get criminal indictments and so forth and download them. And I was always wondering why in these press releases for the U.S. Attorney's Office and the DEA, there would be like two guys with like three or four names, right? Like obviously from Mexico. And they would get like decades in prison. And then there was this long list of names that was obviously, U.S. citizens, right? And they were getting 4 years, 5 years. And I'm like, what is going on here? Is this some issue about race? Is it, what the heck is happening? Well, as you read the indictments, you realize what was going on is Mexico would send two people, right, from a cartel to hire a bunch of U.S. citizens, and they would run a criminal enterprise in the United States to manufacture methamphetamine and then sell it in the United States. So are we going to see that same thing with fentanyl? Yes, most undoubtedly we will see that with fentanyl. Absolutely.
What's the more popular of the two drugs, fentanyl or meth, in terms of sales from the cartels?
I'm going to say fentanyl, and I'm going to tell you why. Okay, check this out. For many years in the marijuana world, right, you could get what was called, hydroponic or kind bud that was grown in California, or you could get what was called Mexican dirtweed, right? Like really bad marijuana from Mexico. Like nobody really wanted it, but it would do for some people. And for many years, Asian countries dominated the heroin world. They had heroin called China White or other really high quality heroins. And the heroin that came out of Mexico was called black tar heroin. Okay. And you just could not get as high on that heroin as you could from the Asian stuff. Okay. Now you introduce fentanyl. You put fentanyl in the Mexican dirtweed and you couldn't possibly get higher, right? You put very cheap fentanyl in the Mexican black tar heroin. Well, now you get higher than you would if you had the most expensive heroin from the world, which would be from Afghanistan or from Southeast Asia, right? So fentanyl dominates everything because it's put into everything. You understand? Um, it is the most intense high that people can possibly get. And that's why so many people are dying, is because the level of expertise all along the way of people who are adding fentanyl to make their drug better, whatever drug it is, right? Is they're not chemists doing this. Okay. You can imagine. And they're inadvertently killing people with it.
Right.
And I personally know of several people in my personal life, my family circles, who have died from fentanyl overdoses who did not know they were doing fentanyl, right? I have more friends who have had brothers and other loved ones die. Um, you know, and this is where things get really tricky because, if you ask someone in Mexico, most of whom are very left leaning, in Mexico, the way their national psyche thinks, they would say, well, it's your demand in the US that's causing this problem. It's your demand.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with that is that you're shifting the blame onto the least of these, onto the people in our society who struggle the most, who have like addiction, whether you buy the disease model or not, people who are not doing very well, who are on, most of whom are really struggling. And you're blaming them instead of these drug lords who have entire armies and make billions of dollars a year. Like somehow it's the low income guy living on the street, right? Who has a mother and father who are probably sick to death that their son is in a cardboard box, right? You're shifting the blame onto that person rather than, the Secretary of State of Mexico, who is absolutely, inarguably, we published on it ad nauseum, connected to El Mencho, right? Who protects and defends El Mencho. And you're taking the blame from all of Mexico's top officials, the most wealthy criminals in the world, and you're putting it onto some guy who lives in a cardboard box.
Thank
Get
you.
her?
Thank you for clarifying that. So from what I've read, the fear that is in the entire country of Mexico, like on an individual city basis, is just intense with just average people living there. What is it like for people to have these cartels just threatening them with businesses, politicians? What is that like?
Well, it depends on where you are, because there are plenty of places in Mexico where you would be just fine to go live. And someone else would be I would not be just fine, but you would be, right? Someone like me would get killed, but you would be okay. Like if you went to Cancun, you're good. You're probably just fine. But you have to understand that most of those resorts you're staying at are owned by cartels. And the ones that are not owned by cartels are paying pesos. They're paying bribes to the cartels for protection. So by going to Mexico, especially for people who talk about blood diamonds and they hate diamonds because of how they're harvested, right? You're on a blood vacation. Like you are fueling cartels when you go to Mexico. When elderly people go, oh, I went to Mexico, I crossed the border in Progreso and it was just fine. And I went right across and went to that pharmacy and got my meds for very cheap. And I said, that's great. What you don't realize is that pharmacy is owned by a cartel. And that's why it's great, is because that cartel keeps that little 2-block area safe so that gringos will come and spend their money there, right? But yes, it is either owned by a cartel or it is paying a lot of extortion to a cartel. You understand?
Yeah, I do. How much of the political activity for just like little towns, how many of the politicians have been corrupted and are being bought by the different cartels?
We could say the vast majority, and I'll tell you why. We live in a different, it's obvious, but I'll say it. We live in a different set of circumstances than do people in Mexico. Okay. We can call 911, right? If We call 911 and they're corrupted. We can get on social media or go to the media and get advocacy. We can talk to our state lawmaker, right? If all else fails, and say that we called 911 and God forbid the police were corrupt, which is usually not the case in this country, we have firearms, right? We can defend ourselves. Okay.
Yeah.
People in Mexico, if they call most of those Mexico, if they call the police are in fact the henchmen for the cartels. When the cartels kill someone and take them, it isn't the guy in like a ninja outfit that shows up. It's the police who arrest you and take you away. And that's the last time you were seen, right? Or it's the military, right? So that's what they operate in. So in Mexico, what they say to you is they say, plato o plomo. Do you want silver or lead? You can either take our money and become very wealthy and do what we say, or we're going to kill everyone in your family. What do you want? And if you lived in that circumstance, if you have children or grandkids, whatever you have, and you lived in that circumstance and you realize there is no one to come help you, right? All the way up the government, this cartel controls. You probably would take the silver too. Most people would, because you have no option.
Right.
And the few who stand up and do otherwise, they get murdered.
They're
They
gone.
get killed. They're
Talk
gone.
to me about the CIA and the FBI. Is what they're doing or trying to do to control the cartels making any impact at all?
Yes, absolutely. Like we talked about earlier, and it kind of go from there. Constantly decapitating. When you have a bunch of sociopathic, you have to realize the structure of a cartel. Okay, you have people at the top who are inarguably, like, you can't, just objectively horrible, narcissistic, sociopathic human beings. Okay, very bad people. Most of them on coke. They are very, very bad people, right? But all of the foot soldiers they depend upon, right? All of the bottom rung that they depend upon. I would venture to say most of them are not objectively bad people. I would say that those are people who probably don't have a lot of options. They got told pato o plomo, right? And they're just young guys who are like, well, what the hell am I going to do? These guys are about to take my sister and sell her into sexual slavery. My mother has no shoes and she's washing everybody in the little village's underwear. So we have some tortillas, right? And these guys are saying they're going to give me a truck, a gun, a radio, and $500 a week, US dollars a week. And all I have to do is stand on this corner and tell them when I see someone coming, right? What would you do? Like, you and I can say, like, well, I wouldn't. Well, here we wouldn't. But in that situation, it's different, right? It's different.
It's become normalized.
Right. So appealing to the hearts of those people for information works. Appealing to those people with money works. Then you go up the ladder and you say, okay, this guy wants to be the boss and that guy wants to be the boss. And he's willing to give us the location of his boss in order so he can be the boss, right? Yeah. So I would say that what the agency and the Bureau and the DEA, what they're doing in Mexico is absolutely wreaking hellfire down on cartels right now. Aside from one, right? Aside from El Nicho. And that's a whole nother problem in itself. But for everyone else in Mexico, absolutely what's happening is effective.
Does Plato o Plomo apply to Claudia Sheinbaum, the president?
Oh, yes and no. So with her, she picked a Secretary of State or Defense, who is openly very good friends with El Nicho, right? I say openly, we published it. And since we published it, others published it. And it's inarguable that he's very good friends with El Mencho. We also know from sources close to him that they talk several times a day, right? Like they're not just friends, they're compadres, right? They're close friends. She picked that guy. At the same time, um, she's trying to govern a country where more than half of it is not under her control, right? Is more than half of it is under the control of these organizations. Uh, did she really have a choice? You understand?
Yeah.
At the same time, she gave us a bunch of people that I could not believe she actually handed over. Like people, Carlo Quintero, right? This guy ruthlessly, he was the head of the Guadalajara cartel, which was the precursor to all of the other cartels in Mexico, right? That was the original cartel. And um, he ruthlessly tortured and killed a USDE agent named Kiki Candarena. Um, what was it, 39 years ago or 29, roughly 30 something years ago. And the US has tried to get him from Mexico every step of the way, and they would never hand him over. And now he's here. Don't forget though that it took them that long to give him to us. Okay. He was put in prison. He he got a judge, he paid a judge, and the judge let him out. It kept happening. And eventually, this president handed him over. It's kind of a big deal, right? They've handed a lot of cartel leadership over to us. However, they're not the ones who are friends with El Mencho, right? So, do I think that applies to her? I think to some extent it does. Yeah.
Some questions are coming in. Could you talk about the recent events in Rio de Janeiro where over 2,000 police participated and 140 cartel members were killed and over 150 arrested? Was that effective?
Okay, so that's a group. I think their name is, I don't know how to call them a cartel. They're definitely a criminal organization that controls a barrio, right? And several barrios. I think they're called CV. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. So the rules in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil as a whole, they have elite police. If the police go in and you kill one of their police officers, they will rain hellfire down upon you and they will kill 10 of yours, right? And that's what happened. What happened is they went in to do a routine law enforcement activity, do action, and one of their guys got killed. And they came back and they took out a bunch of them. And some more of their guys got killed, and so they took out a bunch more. It's really that simple with what happened.
Maria asked the question, is taking out boats that are filled with drugs in international waters making an impact on the cartels, or is there so much fentanyl that it can't possibly be making a difference?
Well, I think that the message that's sent by those boats being blown up really isn't a message to cartels at all, nor is it intended to be. It's a message to El Mencho, and it's a message to Mexico's leadership. That's what it is. It's saying that we are escalating, and if you do not give us El Mencho and you keep protecting this guy, we will take him out ourselves.
So
that's what it's saying.
So we're going to splinter the cartels, take the bosses, even if they have a new one, it'll be smaller. And then we're going to show you with a smaller area like Venezuela what can happen if you don't make progress. Here's a question for you. Have you considered this a post-colonization by Great Britain? Drug running is history of India, Africa, China, and now America using historical global seafaring and colonial experiences of the British Empire. But British extended family still exists. Mexico is really funded by Great Britain, initially in the city of London. There's a lot there.
That's a lot to unpack. So I will do my best to unpack that. Okay. So what I think when it comes to China is a nation that has strict control over everything that its citizens say. over everything that its citizens do, over everything that's manufactured in this country, right? Over everything that's shipped. So does the central government of China know exactly who is making the precursors and shipping them to Mexican cartels? Yes, absolutely. One. Two, in the minds of the Chinese government, are they trying to weaken us and tear our society apart by doing that? Yes. In the minds of the Chinese government, do they see it as payback for the colonial history of Great Britain and the Opium Wars and the West pumping opium and getting everyone addicted to opium in China yes, they absolutely do. I believe that. I hope that addresses some of that, if that's what the
Good
caller was
question.
trying to get at.
Whoever submitted that one. So question. When this cartel Jalisco that you talked about, we've named that a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. government has. When we name a cartel a foreign terrorist organization, is there impact there?
Yes, there's impact there in a big way. There's impact economically. There's impact with anyone who takes money from them or gives them money. Anyone who provides them a service, anyone who helps them in any way is now aiding a foreign terrorist organization. There's also impact in what's acceptable for us to do to them. You understand? If you're a fugitive, the U.S. government is not going to go kill you. If you're a foreign terror organization leader, and they can't arrest you, they might, and that is a big difference.
If you're a business owner in Mexico, is it even possible for you to operate without paying people off?
In some regions it is, but in most places, no. But they do it in a very discreet way. So like there's these companies called maquiladoras, right? Like the factories, right? A lot of them producing stuff for the US. The factories do not pay cartels. Like Ford Motor Company does not pay a cartel, right? But they do. What they do is they pay a security consultant in the security consultant's team, right? And that team keeps things secure by interacting with the local criminals. They might interact with the local politicians and the police chief, who then goes, hey, we're going to need, $30,000 a month. And that'll keep this group quiet and make this group leave you alone. And for $50,000 a month, not only will they leave you alone, but they'll make sure everyone else does too. And they'll say, okay. And they pay their security consultants, and their security consultants pay the mayor and the police chief, who in fact work for and at the behest of the local cartel. That's how it works.
I heard you mention it this morning on the radio, and one of the articles I read that the big thing with the cartels has been to try to control territory. Did you mention that about half the territory in Mexico, or about a third, is now controlled?
More than half. So more than half, yeah. More than half. So 32 states, roughly, I would say at least 17 fall into that definition of absolutely controlled. But see, this is, kind of like to address other questions you've asked with what the agency is doing, what the Bureau is doing, what the DEA is doing, what the U.S. government is doing, the intelligence community and the law enforcement community. The name of the game is to take a cartel that can sway the entire Mexican government and put them in a situation where they no longer can, right? And that's the name of the game. That's how they're getting beaten. Problem is, there's still one big one that has that federal control, but all of the others don't.
Thank you for that clarity. That really explains it. Very well. Do you believe that after Trump met with Xi in China, do you believe the precursors will stop coming to Mexico, or will Mexico just go on to another drug?
Well, I don't believe that they'll. Okay, so the word believe is kind of there's a lot of room with believe, right? Like it's kind of like John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world, whoever believes in his son. Okay, that word believes, that means just because I know Jesus is there, does that mean that? Or does it mean like, would you really get into that word in the Koine Greek? It's like, no, devotes his life to, the believe is a very meaningful word, right? It
Right.
means something different than do I believe. So do I believe that they're going to stop trying to poison our country? Absolutely not. I don't believe it. Uh, do I believe that they're going to continue? No, I don't believe either. I think the most likely scenario is they keep poisoning us. And and even if they do stop what they've obviously fueled and helped start, um, that's poisoned our country, the Mexican groups will just start manufacturing their own. Yeah. But I don't believe that at all because I just tell you right now, and I don't want to bring up things that, are off topic, but one of the things I've been noticing a lot is the way that a lot of people right now on the right, I'm very surprised by their hatred of one of our allies, right? And the people who live in that country. And I'm trying to figure out what in the heck is going on. And then I realized the vast majority of the anger and noise are coming from bots that are obviously being paid for. Who are they being paid by? Right? Well, they're being paid by Russia or China. They're trying to sow dissension. They have invested with TikTok. With TikTok, the real issue isn't what the media says. It's not that they collect your data. Every game on your phone collects your data and they sell your data and China could just buy it from there. The reason TikTok is a problem is that it's an outrage machine, right? It's an outrage machine. So when I look at a country who is our enemy and I see them trying to poison our minds, right? In every way imaginable and poison our body politic. And I also see that they've historically poisoned our bodies and with poison, right? Literal drugs. Do I think that they're going to stop that? No.
And when I
Every
look at
indicator is that it's
yeah,
so
and
widespread.
when I look at TikTok, I'm wondering why, when we passed a law to get rid of it, why it's still up there. We got a firing round of a couple questions. This is a logical one from Michelle. Living in Cincinnati, should we stop traveling to Mexico because it's controlled by the cartels?
Well, I would not go unless I'm going for the purpose of fighting cartel. I have a lot of knowledge and uh, about it and just the nature of who I am. I cannot go somewhere like, okay, my friend said, let's go to the Dominican Republic, right?
Yeah.
And I said, okay. And they're like, it's totally safe. They have fences and walls and chain link and guards. And I'm like, yeah, the problem is you're going to be looking out at the blue water and I'm going to be looking past the chain link, wanting to know why those people's lives are horrible and how I could do something to help fix it or make it a little bit better, at least for some people. And if you're someone who from Cincinnati who is like me, don't go to Mexico. Okay. If you can go and look at the blue water, that's your choice, right? There's all kinds of things. Like I love avocados. The avocados that come from California to me are usually not as tasty as the ones that come from Mexico. Guess who controls the avocado industry in Mexico? Mostly Cartel Jalisco and El Mincho. So like I support all kinds of things I'd rather not support um, because I like the way they taste or because it would inconvenience my life. I'm not that person who's going to say you should or shouldn't. But I will tell you that um, you just need to realize that it's almost like a Potemkin village in North Korea. Okay. The Mexico you go see when you travel there as a tourist is not reality. It's a fictitious world created by cartels to extract resources from you. And you have to realize that that peace and serenity you feel is fake, that the people who live there do not feel it.
Understand the risks. Here's another question. Precursors are a part of the normal supply chain. How do you stop a non-drug process?
I don't know. What I would do is I would probably, if I were the U.S. government, I would probably continue to buy as much data or information about China and shipping logs and Mexico's shipping logs as possible. And I would try to identify who was, for the lack of a better term, bastardizing the normal trade process and the normal manufacturing process. And I would take those people out. That's what I would do. But you can't stop all precursors, but some precursors are in fact things that are only likely to be used for fentanyl or some for methamphetamine.
A few comments I feel like I want to make for people that have been interested tonight, Brandon. One is TikTok is now owned by Larry Ellison, the owner of Oracle. This is a hint of what is actually happening. You will own nothing. China is not the problem. Another comment, taxes is paying off the federal government, not so effective these days. And a third one, bet president of Mexico has the same donor class as Washington, D.C. And 50-year mortgages, you will own nothing. Be happy on fentanyl. And finally, remember the globalist theme, you will own nothing. So when you wake up every morning, you've done this now for 11 years. It's got to have been really hard. What is your passion to keep you going on something that's this important?
Okay. This is a big part of why I don't get scared, because everyone listens and you're like, well, you have kids, you have family, aren't you scared? How could you do this to your family? Right. And what I think about is what my country will become if we don't do this. And I would say, how can you do that to your family, right? To your kids and your grandkids? I don't get scared because, okay, and there's no way to get around this. There's no way not to bring up God in this conversation. But I want to say before I do that, I have so many vices, right? I drink coffee. I love whiskey. Like, I don't get crazy, but sometimes at night, if I can't sleep, I drink a little whiskey. And most of my life I was single, and I had a daughter out of wedlock. I am not trying to portray myself as this ultra sanctified person in any way, right? So no one can call me a hypocrite. However, we look at Matthew 25, okay? In the latter half of the chapter. And it's the parable about the sheep and the goats, And he says, he'll divide the good and the bad, and he'll say, okay, I was hungry and you fed me. I was cold and you clothed me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. I was sick and you held me. And his followers will say, Lord, when did we see, yeah, we've helped a lot of people, but when did we ever see you sick or thirsty or hungry or in prison? And he said, whatsoever you did unto the least of these, you did unto me. And then he will look at the others and he will say, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was cold and you did not clothe me. And they said, Lord, when would we ever turn you away? He goes, whatsoever you did not do unto the least of these, you did not do unto me. Right? And it is all about that for me, right? As imperfect as I am in every other way, and as much as I'm sure people in whatever church I go to would gossip about me because of something I do in my personal life, the idea that there are people who need help and they're unable to do it for themselves because of factors that are outside of their control. And my responsibility to those people is what drives this project. And it is true for Pancho Ortiz, Il Defanzo. It is true for many of the others who work with us. it is about doing unto the least of these and being a voice for the voiceless. And Andrew Breitbart was a voice for the voiceless in this country. We do the same thing Andrew did. We just do it in a little more of an intense way, right? And that's it. Yes, it drives you crazy when all day long I have to look at pictures and videos of people being murdered, and I have to hear these horrible stories. And we've lost people along the way under questionable. We had a writer who drowned in Chiapas, Mexico, right? Who was there investigating Cartel Jalisco and their connections to the local police departments, right? And the state police. We've had a lot of really horrible things happen, but ultimately we know we are doing what God wants us to do in this case.
That's a good place for us to end. And when we gossip about you, Brandon, we're only going to have great things to say, because you have just provided such an interesting program, from telling us about visiting Mexico to telling us about the big scheme project of trying to stop cartels that have control over the whole government, to divide and conquer. And thank you tonight for joining Empower You and just filling us in on your work. And once again, thank goodness for people like Breitbart that will take on challenges like this. Thank you so much for joining us, Brandon. Darby, have a great night. Grab another cup of coffee, and thank you.
Thank you.